Computer.
Let me hit my got it. 1 second. There you go.
So Kathy, thank you again for finding the time to meet with me. Congratulations on your book. Do you have a copy by any chance?
I do.
Let's show it. Just wave it in front of the screen. Yeah, that's a huge
The labor of love.
Yeah, I have read it. I greatly enjoyed it.
Oh, good.
Yeah, it's kind of like 3 books in one, really. One is the memoir, and the other part is advice, and the third part is your conversations with our mutual friends.
You're so good. You picked up on the tapestry that we were trying to create, which was probably the hardest part of writing the book. Like, there's no point in sharing the stories from my memoir or personal narrative side unless they actually contribute to the what to do's. And I think we did it that way because I had to be honest with you, Paul. I don't read a lot of what to do books. I
Mm-hmm.
like reading books that have stories and characters. And so we thought this would be a much better way to go.
Well, the way you describe it, it's a progression from WTF to WTD.
Exactly.
And it's precisely that. Um, yeah, my favorite part is the memoir because it just tells an amazing story. And I knew some of this because I don't know if you know this, but we were introduced by Ellen Stovall
Oh my gosh, isn't that amazing?
25
Wow.
years ago, give or take.
She was such an incredible woman. Yeah.
Well, she said the same about you.
Oh,
And I remember precisely what she said. She said, Kathy Giusti is somebody to know because she does not get tired of telling people that bullshit does not cure cancer.
well, that's well said. I have to say, that's very well said.
Well, speaking of the memoir, that part kind of explains it. I knew it in real time, but it's not really visible prospectively. You kind of have to look back what was going on, which is you had smoldering myeloma. You had, and what, maybe 3, 4 years to find the cure. Plus, you also had IVF to have a kid. I knew some of this, but I know all of this. It's an amazing story.
Yeah, it sounds a little frenetic, doesn't it? On one hand, you're trying not to die, and on the other hand, you're trying to create a life. So the two things going on at the same time were really quite something. But as you know it all too well, like back then, myeloma was so unbelievably fatal that the whole reason I'm able to write that personal narrative is because on my way out of Borders, where I was trying to learn everything I could about myeloma, I picked up that journal because I was writing to our daughter, Nicole. And that was really the start of it, that, I was writing to her because it was the only way I could think of that she could remember me. I would just document everything we were doing together and the places we were going and anything that we were sharing. And now here it is, 26 years later, and I have like 26 journals, one for every year I never expected to live. And I really had to go back and read them, from cover to cover in order to write the book. But they really did give me a lot of insight into the toll that cancer really takes on a family when you're trying to get through it. A whole different perspective.
What was it like? Were there any surprises when you look back at 25 years of journals? I don't know anybody who has 25 years of journals.
No, I think that's what makes the book so interesting is because when you're reading the book, you're realizing the shift I'm making, that the very first journal has a sunflower on the front. It's sitting here on my desk, and yeah, sure. And inside, it's really funny. Like, this was the first one, and then inside this journal are still like letters that I had written, things that I had saved for our daughter, like all the things. So when you pick up a journal and everything starts falling out from, 26 years ago, it's pretty eye-opening. And you can see how I'm writing. And in the first few journals, I'm assuming I'm dying. I mean, I'm just creating a plan to die. And all I want to do is, build our family and leave my husband and Nicole really safe and happy. That was my goal. And if I lived long enough that Nicole made it to kindergarten, that was a stretch goal. And so, all of a sudden now I'm hitting those milestones, and I had my son and things are happening. And as you know, the story starts to build out that the MMRF started working with the whole community. And next thing we knew, drugs were starting to surface like thalidomide and Velcade, and it was starting to change the entire landscape of myeloma. And you can feel it as I'm writing. Like there's a certain conference that I'm at, a myeloma conference. And I'm realizing like, oh my God, we are finally making progress. And I start to write differently.
Oh, fascinating. Maybe we should go back a little bit, because not only do you survive, but you also help develop the two drugs you later got as part of the transplant, which is Velcade and Revlimid, which did not exist at the time you had your smoldering, high-risk smoldering myeloma, which is an astounding thing. Lots of people wished for the cure, but you actually built the damn thing.
Yeah, it was such a fascinating time, but it shows you that when you have a rare cancer that is neglected, everybody that's working on it, and again, it has no money, no funding, right? So everybody working on it feels the same. Like if only we could get more eyes on this cancer, if only we could get more support. So you really do build a community of academic centers, pharmaceutical companies, NCI. And I think that was the gift of starting the Multiple Myeloma Research Foundation, was building that community and running the roundtables and keeping all of us together, focused around one strategic plan. But it was really thalidomide that came in and kind of changed the way we thought about myeloma. And I write about that in the book. Like all of a sudden, a patient is requesting this drug for her husband, and it didn't
Yeah,
work for him, but it worked for the next patient.
Yeah, Beth,
It was
right?
crazy. I mean, it was just an amazing time. And now here's Celgene not able to communicate a lot to the patient community because they don't have an approved drug. And so I'm starting the foundation and I have a patient database, and at least I'm able to communicate out to the patient community what's going on with thalidomide. And again, because I came from pharma, I actually had been through enough medical, legal, regulatory meetings to write beautiful newsletters and things like that that would not get me in trouble. I was always writing like, okay, here's the benefit, but here are the risks. I was so trained on that. And so we were able to work with Celgene on thalidomide. And then of course, Saul Bearer was there back then. And, we kept moving things off to Revlimid and then Pomalyst. And at the same time, there's a beautiful story in the book about Julian Adams, where again, the science is amazing. And sometimes, Paul, there's just a tad of serendipity, because on Velcade, when Julian was doing the very first trial, it was a phase 1. It was all comers. And he happened to put a multiple myeloma patient into that phase 1, and the patient went into a complete remission. And that changed everything. At that point, Julian's calling me. And of course, we had a meeting because we were always convening the myeloma community. We had a meeting ready to go, and he just took it over. They write the protocol, and like we just saved so much time for patients. So yeah, it was a really exciting time, and kind of played to my strength because I had been in pharma. So I loved that kind of work.
Yeah, you were an executive with Searle.
Right. And before that with Merck. So, that came naturally to me. The things that didn't necessarily come as naturally were more of the policy or touchy-feely or the art of fundraising, which you have to learn pretty quickly.
Why wasn't that? I'm looking back at it, was so logical that a lawyer could see it. I'm talking about Beth Walmer Jacob.
Yeah.
She saw it and she called Judah.
Barligy.
I thought she called Judah Folkman first.
Well, she might have called him first because he was doing all the work in angiogenesis. And ironically, we had done a roundtable with him as well on that topic. So he was doing some beautiful work in that, and she picked up on it. And maybe then they got to Bart.
But you were already doing work with
Yeah.
MMRF. That already
Yes.
existed, right?
Yeah.
When her husband needed.
Yes, absolutely.
But why wasn't this happening? Why weren't doctors thinking of it? Because, thalidomide's a pretty old drug, God help us.
I know, I know. I think, people get stuck in a certain path. And it was really funny in myeloma at that time, the focus was on stem cell transplant. Remember, that was still really new to multiple myeloma. So we were spending a lot of time like, how successful is stem cell transplant? Who should be getting it? Should it be autologous? Should it be allogeneic? How do we get Medicare to cover it? That was one of the first projects I ever worked on, was trying to get stem cell transplant covered. And then on top of transplant was vaccines. So this was really interesting. Like, one of our first roundtables was on vaccine work in melanoma. We wanted to transfer the knowledge of melanoma over to myeloma. And so we did it with NCI. And I mean, this was back in, 1998 or 1999. We were doing immunotherapy. And everybody was looking at DNA vaccines, dendritic cell vaccines. So the whole focus was in stem cell and vaccine. And then when thalidomide emerged, it really did get everybody thinking outside the box, which was a good thing. And then all of a sudden now we're shifting over to angiogenesis and novel drugs. And again, every time this happens, we have to be smart and write an updated strategic plan to decide how are we spending our money. We're putting less money now into vaccines and more money into novel therapies and things like that.
Well, but why weren't they really thinking? Why wasn't pharma thinking that there was money to be made? Look at Celgene, sold for a pretty chunk of change.
Yeah, I think it's because myeloma is a small, uncommon cancer, right? So back then, rare disease. Where farmers started getting interested was realizing that we had a great biomarker. Like, it's so easy to follow a multiple myeloma patient in a clinical trial. All you have to do is really follow our M-spike. And so you could get trials done really quickly in myeloma. So we were communicating that out. Like, remember, the myeloma community back then was very small. There were like 4 to 6 academic centers actually working in myeloma. So we did not have a loud voice at all. Now, all of a sudden, our voice is getting louder. We're spending a lot of time with NCI, down at FDA. We're trying to build bridges. And I think the combination of knowing we had a biomarker, that novel drugs were starting to work, and the fact that it had such high unmet need meant that FDA would work with us to get these drugs approved. I think that's when pharma started saying, this is an interesting disease to take a look at.
This was before Pasteur even.
Yeah.
But Pasteur, I'm sure, helped. That must
Oh,
be.
he was amazing. I mean, I have to say, one of the best partners we had in the field of multiple myeloma was FDA. Absolutely.
And he comes in around year 2000. So by then, there's already a lot of the work's already done, but there's a lot to do.
Yeah, because it's around that time that you're starting to see Revlimid, and Velcade is just starting to emerge. And fortunately, Saul Baer was also committed to keeping Pomalyst in the pipeline at the same time too. So there's a lot going on. And of course, we were still looking at stem cell transplant. And back then, there was still a lot of discussion of how to do it. Do you do 2 transplants? Do you do 1 transplant, see how the patient does, and then consider doing a second? Do you dare do allo transplant, or is it still too fatal? So there's a lot of work going on in that space too.
Yeah, because it's the most astounding thing about this story is not only do you actually, I'm going to quote Jerry Groupman's profile of you from I think 2007, which was quite beautiful. And he kind of wrote that here's a new kind of patient who is trying to buy their own cure, which is what you were doing. You were really.
I really was. And I can't say I did it intentionally. I just did it because I was very fortunate that I was, early on, I was still working at Searle. And ironically, they were doing a United Way campaign, and all of the employees wanted to support the United Way campaign and support myeloma research. So it shifted. And then thank goodness my identical twin was an attorney. And that's what got the foundation off the ground. So it wasn't like I was saying, oh my gosh, I'm just going to go start a foundation and save my life. But once we could start funding research, I felt like if I could bring more scientists into the fold, like if I just got that much done, maybe I would see Nicole to kindergarten. Maybe I would beat the 3 years and get 3.5 or 4 or something and do a little bit better. And that was all I was thinking. And then all of a sudden, this foundation starts to take on a life of its own.
So not only do you have this drive and the vision, but you also have an identical twin, which comes into play because of the stem cell transplant. Good
Yeah,
God.
it's so, I think that part's really important because, you know, I'm not your typical patient. And I say that in the book. Like the things about me are I had a really good science background and I had great insurance and I had a phenomenal support system and I had an identical twin. And my whole point of writing the book was to say, I had all of that and I still got it wrong. I still messed up. Like,
So that was much later. We'll get to that.
yeah, but I
Yeah,
mean, I even messed up along the way. And so when you
right.
go back and read it, you're like, how can we possibly expect patients that don't live in this world that I do to be able to figure this craziness out? It's a challenge.
You quote Cliff Huddis saying, "This is not a system," which it's the American healthcare system is not a system.
Right. Right. It's a disaster.
It's a
It's
disaster.
absolutely a disaster. And I think my 3 biggest issues with the system are, number 1, it is so fragmented and it is left to the patient to integrate it. So, you get a cancer diagnosis, it may come in from your internist or primary care, remember a suspicion, and now you've got to figure out medical oncologist, surgical oncologist, pathologist, radiation oncologist. Like your head is spinning, and then you've got to put all those people together. And I think the second piece is that now the science moves so fast that you have to try to stay on top of the science in making your decisions. And the doctor only has 16 minutes with you on average. So it's you and your partner. It could be your son, your daughter, your husband, your wife. Like you are now really trying to figure out these incredibly challenging decisions and reading lots of high science that you don't understand. And that's hugely frustrating. And then the third is the cost. Like it's so easy to get stuck without a pocket. It's so easy to mess up on the reimbursement side. And so you're constantly having to be on with insurance companies and it just creates stress. And I think that's why, another reason why I wrote it was like, just be aware of these things and find people to help you with it. Because if you take it all on yourself, it will wear you down.
Plus, you had all these friends too. What is it, the 8 as you
The
described?
8,
Yes.
I still have the 8, thank God. And that's like another thing I say, like, who has 8 friends willing to help them? Like I'm an extreme. Like not everybody has that. It doesn't matter. You don't have to have 8. Like my point is when it gets to knowing what your needs and wants are, if you can find 1 or 2 people that will help you and you work with them wisely, you will be okay. It will help you so much.
But I guess that's kind of an artifact of a retroactive look at of really every memoir, is that everything works out.
I know. Although you really can tell by the time I'm getting to the end of the book, I'm like, geez, I screwed. Like, so I really do feel like it ends fine, but it probably could have ended better if I'd been more on my game or watching what was going on around me more. And so I
Well, you're
felt it was
stuck
really
about that.
important.
Where
What's
do
that?
you think you screwed up? You don't screw up very much, but in the end, there is at the end of the book, there is a mishap that you see as kind of your own
Yeah.
per se. Well,
Yes.
can we talk about that?
Yeah. So the biggest takeaway for me was I was always focused on cancer from the patient's perspective. And I was always focused on it from the business perspective. How are we going to drive the MMR forward? How are we going to make more progress? How will we see more drugs? How will we save the next life? And I was always petrified that I was going to relapse. I still am. I still, it's not like I go to Dana-Farber and think, oh, I'm cured. I don't. I am always wondering what's next when a patient relapses. And I think the book was more eye-opening for me, reading about everything that the people around me were sacrificing. So, the examples I give in the book are, I'm heading up for a stem cell transplant, and that was happening in 2006. And just to get me through the Cytoxan, the chemotherapy, harvest the stem cells, I was doing it with my sister. I mean, she was going through a really tough time. She was going through a divorce. And all I could think about was, did she get her Neupogen shots? How are her stem cells doing? How is she going to meet me at Dana-Farber? She had 3 little ones at home. How are we handling babysitters? And she had so much on her plate. And the same thing for my husband. Like, now I'm gone. I'm gone for 3 to 4 weeks by myself. And same thing for our children. Like, Nicole was in 6th grade in middle school, and now I'm gone. And she's petrified. Like, you can tell she's scared. And I write about this in the book. Like, she felt like she had to be the perfect child. God forbid she get me sick. She get me worried. She concerned me for any reason whatsoever. Like, she just felt she had to be so perfect. And I think looking back on that, it was a really tough time when I was not paying attention to the toll it was taking on everyone around me. And then you get through it and everybody's looking at you like, okay, we're done. Like, this has been a lot of time, a lot of energy. We all work. Everybody was working. That was my caregiver. And now I'm depressed. And I'm feeling like I can't function in this world. I don't know what to do with myself. And the first person I call again is my sister, and I drag her back up to work with me again. And so you read the book and you're like, oh my God, I really needed a lot of people. My friends were constantly coming over and making food and things like this. And so I handled my medical pretty well because I didn't feel like anybody else could handle the medical as well as I could. I was going to study it, know it, be on it. But it was the other things that I failed to pay attention to. And I think it did take a toll on people around me, a big toll.
But also, you described the breast cancer episode.
Yeah, the breast cancer was so different because in myeloma, our son David was only in 3rd grade and Nicole was in middle school. And so for him, he doesn't really remember a lot of it. There's certain things he does, but a lot of it, he was just there to keep me laughing and keep me company, play Battleship with me, play games with me, do puzzles, whatever, while I was home so sick after the transplant. By the time I got to breast cancer, he's an adult. And, he is worried because he hasn't been through this before in a way that he remembers it. And he's like, this is brutal. And, now I'm going in for surgery and, you're describing the surgery and then you think you're going to get through it quickly. And of course he took off work, he and Nicole, everybody took off work to get me through the surgery and be home because he was going to cook, walk the dogs, do everything. And sure enough, they're all home, took off work. I got COVID. Couldn't go in for the surgery, got delayed 2 weeks. And now he feels horrible because he can't take off work again. So he's desperately trying to, he's getting home on all the weekends. And, at a certain point, Nicole ended up having to move out west and David was, by my side with his girlfriend. So you switch and now he is, doing a fair amount of the caregiving and he's watching and I'm getting really sick with infections. And there's a point in time where both Nicole and David are home and I realize I think I have sepsis. Like, I am so sick and it's Memorial Day weekend and they have to handle me, and thank God they're really rational and smart. And we got me back to the hospital, got me there in time, and it was brutal, and it's hard to put your kids through that. It's a lot. It was a holiday weekend. They came They come home thinking we're gonna have great times. Oh, good. We're so glad we're not in the city right now. And then all of a sudden, oh, nope, we're back in the city at Mount Sinai.
Oh my God,
Um,
mom has sepsis.
mom is super sick. And I think just seeing all that over and over again, and it wasn't even just me. You have to realize that for our kids, their grandmother had melanoma. So they watched that. Like she was always showing up with stitches all over her face, her scalp. And then, my sister ends up with stage 3 breast cancer. So our kids have seen a lot of illness, a lot of illness.
Hmm. Plus your father-in-law had,
Yeah, they never met him.
oh,
He died so young. But they knew that he had died of renal cell carcinoma. So
mhm.
it's really interesting. Like, how your kids have to put together the charts of the family. Here's my mom, here's my dad, here's the grandparents. And after doing this, we kept going through and saying, well, what happened to that one? What happened to that one? And like, finally at the end, I'm like, we have the worst genes. Like, we, these, these are horrible genes. And since my sister is an identical twin, like her family, and she has 3 children, all there's 5 cousins, they feel the same way. We're like, we all are screwed. All 5 of us have really lousy genes. And
Well,
that's why, like, it's funny, even with these new articles that come out, Paul, on the increased incidence of cancer in young people, colorectal, cervical, like, I'm talking to my kids about this, and I write this in the book, like, get your kids to a really good primary care doctor. They need to be seen. They need to get physicals. They don't think about it, but they have to have a place to go.
absolutely. Was a very interesting piece for me was looking for people I know. It's kind of like a modified Washington Read. The Washington Read is where you just check whether you're in there. I'm not in there, but I was looking for people I know. And it was nice to see them, and it was nice to see how you describe them. I think one person that kind of has a place of honor in this book is Ken Anderson.
Yeah, he was a very, and still is, an incredible clinician. And there for his patients 24/7. The man worked tirelessly. And I love the sections in the book where I'm talking about my sister Karen, my identical twin, and I coming up there. And we really felt like identical twins were something that should be studied. And, for doctors, they're taught do no harm. And so we had to honestly like keep going back to Ken and saying, you don't understand, like we are raising our hand. We're going to be really upset if you don't take us up on this offer. We really want to be doing this. And it took everything he had because now he's doing bone marrow aspirates with my sister, who's a healthy subject. And so, but the work was really productive and it told us a lot what genes are turned on and off in each other. Her immune system at that point was better than my immune system. So there was just a lot of really good information we were finding. And as you could sense, the beauty of Ken Anderson is he's a great clinician, but he's also a great translational doctor. It was true bench to bedside at Dana-Farber.
Well,
They're doing genome sequencing and they're doing or gene expression profiling, and they're learning everything they can, and then they're tying that back to the clinic. It's really important.
plus you were one of the first people to get PCR testing.
I was very fortunate in that because I was a 414 and Ken knew anecdotally that Velcade was a nice drug for 414. And at that point, remember, 414s are really, really high risk. They're still high risk, but there's not as much concern about it as there used to be. And because of that, Ken really did battle to try to get me on that soon.
Mhm. So you set up the MMRF and you play a role in development of a bunch of drugs. And also really the needle is moved on multiple myeloma. Do you have the numbers on that? How does that do? It's these.
Well, at this point, there's over 15 drugs approved in multiple myeloma. As you remember, there was a flurry of activity that happened moving from thalidomide to Revlimid to Velcade and building out the proteasome inhibitor category. And so we were all on triplet therapy for quite a period of time. And I remember Ken had a great spore grant that he was doing to just kind of say, how are we combining these classes of drugs and how do we make them the best that they can be? And so we learned a tremendous amount about that information. And then I think the next thing that happened in myeloma, and we spent a lot of time, by the way, on all of that work, trying to make sure we understood it really well. And also how it worked with stem cell transplant. And then I think when daratumumab came along, that was really fascinating to understand because now you're looking at antibodies and you're also watching how long it takes to get a really, really good drug like Dara into the hands of all patients. Because again, remember, everything is done in relapse refractory patients. You're trying to figure out combination approaches. And, now in today's world, most doctors will tell you if you have myeloma to go ahead and start with a quad therapy, including daratumumab. So that moved us into the antibody space. And now, as you know, we're in the next revolution of multiple myeloma, which is immunotherapy. And I feel like this time right now is reminding me of the same time we had when we were sitting there with stem cell transplant and the triplet. And we're trying to figure out, like, what do we do to make sure that we're getting patients into as deep a response as we possibly can? And there was a lot of work going on there. If you remember, like, it's hard. Pharma looks at their own drugs. It's not so easy to do tons and tons of trials, looking at sequencing, dosing, all those kinds of things. And so unfortunately for the patient, we don't get that information that fast. Now with immunotherapy, it's kind of the same thing where there's a multitude of drugs, and now we're trying to figure out how to use them. And, just like stem cell transplant took a long time to get out to the community because it's hard to do and you didn't want to mess with that if you were out at a community center. It's the same thing with immunotherapy. Like, we know we should move it to the community. Everybody wants to move it to the community, but these drugs are toxic. They're hard to take and hard to deliver. And as a result, now we're in another situation again where it feels a little unfair that the patients that can afford and are at the academic centers are more likely to get these immunotherapies than the patients sitting at the community centers. And that tells you a lot about myeloma, which skews older male and African American, that one of the biggest jobs we have as a community is making sure that treatment is fair and that we have full access for all patients. And I think that's really one of the things that the MMRF is 100% dedicated to right now, is saying there are so many really good drugs. I even think between the drugs that we have approved and the ones that are in the pipeline right now and in trials, we probably have some curative approaches, but we have to speed the process of making them less toxic, knowing how to combine them, knowing how to sequence them, having a real clear journey for the patient, and getting things to the community. It's a big job, but it's important.
That's an amazing question. How do community oncologists operate? Because it's very, but no, it's a very different world most of the time. And in multiple myeloma, you just shouldn't go there in a way, is what you're probably saying.
Well, it's really tricky. If you want to get some of these tough to take therapeutics, first of all, you may not be able to get it at a community, right? Because they're doing the trials and they're doing a lot of the work at the academic centers because they have to. Over time, I think everybody finds a way to make it easier and it will shift out to the community, but it takes so long. And I still feel like, God, so many times we wrote the marketing plan for the MMRF and we were always trying to create a hub and spoke environment where you're really creating this kind of like netting between the academic centers and the community. I think that over time that might happen as the NCI, for example, says to the NCI cancer centers, you don't get your cancer center grants unless you are treating all patients and all kinds of patients. And I think that is forcing some of the cancer centers to really open up their doors and create better relationships out of the community. Because you have to bring the drugs and the trials to the patient. There's just no way with people working and trying to get through this that they possibly can do it and get through tolerating tough drugs. It could save their life.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, look at you.
Yeah, no, it's really true. And I mean, I think that's why I love the whole thing of immunotherapy, because I do feel like I benefited from that with my twin sister. And then when I relapsed, doing donor lymphocyte infusion. So I feel like there's a lot to what's going on here.
Yeah, it's almost like at the level where a complete agnostic like me wonders whether somebody's looking after you.
We can only hope. I don't know.
That's not a question. I withdraw my question. Uh, so I guess the one question I did not yet ask, one area we didn't yet cover was the accelerator you were running at Harvard. How
Yes,
did
I
that go?
loved that job. I loved that job. It's just so coincidental, that here I was, helping and caring for my sister, who had stage 3 breast cancer, which is tough, and really scary. And she's still scared. And and she's a single mom trying to figure out her insurance. So that's why I love her as a character in the book, because she had different issues than me, and they're real issues, and they were incredibly important. So I had her, she was being, I was working with her and trying to get her to the right doctor. She decided on MSK. And at the same time, I was working with my mom who had melanoma, and I had her at UPenn. And then I'm being treated at Dana-Farber. So I'm just doing the circuit from one center to the next. And we all had community centers we were working with too. It's just these academic centers were our team approach of have an academic advisor and have a community center that can work with you. And then all of a sudden, this call comes in from the dean of Harvard Business School saying, we love your model. We love what you've done at the MMRF, and Robert Kraft wants to work on precision medicine. Would you come up here and run a program around precision medicine across all cancers and diseases? And I thought, this is probably meant to be, because why else would this be happening right now? And it was just an amazing time to work directly for the dean, and Robert Kraft was a true learning experience for me. And I was blown away at how collaborative people are. And this is what I found at the MMRF too. If you can lead with a strong strategic plan, and you can bring everybody in from all facets of the community to chime in, have a point of view, you're never going to all agree, but you have to work through it and reach some level of consensus and keep moving forward. If you take that same concept and go up to Harvard and say, look, there's a lot that myeloma can learn from pancreatic and brain tumors and breast cancer. And by the way, there's a lot that Alzheimer's can learn from cancer. And so, looking at it that way, I would bring like the brightest minds up onto campus with my co-chair, Richard Hammermesh, and we would just make them think like business people and, follow the money, figure out what the incentives are. What are you doing here? And we really trained them all to think differently. And I love the fact that we have left behind a full playbook for anybody looking to start a foundation, because I get a lot of calls like that. And I always say, go to the Craft Accelerator site first. You will find every article I've ever written with Richard, every case study we used, and you will find the MMR strategic plan I was writing at the same time, and it will tell you how to do it. And that was my playbook for foundation leaders. And I felt like this is really good. At least they have a place to go. And thousands of people have used it, which is great. But then I basically had to finish there after COVID. And it was like, we don't have a playbook for patients. We just don't have one. So that's when I knew it was time to start doing that.
Are you doing that now? Yeah, that's your book.
That's the book.
That's the book.
Yes. And
Mm.
that's really why I wrote it, was I felt like I knew how scared I was after having, and the irony of it all, as you know, Paul, is I sit down to write the book. I'm going through all the journals. I'm getting ready. I've decided that it's going to be HarperCollins that works on the book with me, getting all my thoughts together and things. And then I get breast cancer. And, I was just reminded like, oh my God, this system is still the same broken system. It's just different. Like with myeloma, I couldn't find any articles. Nobody had been working on it. And we didn't have the internet. So I'm sitting on the floor of Borders books, just hoping I can find something I understand on the topic. In breast cancer, and I write this in the book too, like I'm sitting in the car going, oh God, looking at my husband going, it's early, it's fine. Let me just Google a little bit here. I get 2 billion hits, 2 billion. Like, what am I going to do with that? And so, the world has changed so much in terms of the responsibility on the patient. that it's just crazy. So, I mean, I felt it back then when I got diagnosed with myeloma, but now you are the curator of information, of your own information to save your own life. And that's why the first parts of the book are like, get on your game, don't go down the rabbit holes, don't get distracted, go to the best sites, get to the best doctors, and stay focused. And it's really the most important part from the moment you get diagnosed. And Paul, remember now in today's world, we get diagnosed on our portals before the doctor tells us. I mean, at least with myeloma, I had this lovely internist, kind of softly telling me what was happening with myeloma and then, moving over to my hemonc. In this situation today, so many patients are reading their portal and realizing they have cancer and the doctor can't get to them. So they're immediately going on to Google.
Yeah, I don't know how informed decision-making is being done in breast cancer. That's got
It's
to be extraordinarily difficult.
It's so hard. Yeah, I always thought like myeloma was so confusing because it's a blood cancer, but it affects the kidneys and the bones, and the name doesn't make sense, and it's just a confusing cancer. And I thought, oh, breast cancer will be so much more logical, but there's so many types of breast cancer and so many approaches, and it's really hard to get consensus, and so many of the decisions are left with the patient. In my situation, I took a really aggressive approach. I'm sure there are many people that would say, doing a double mastectomy for such early breast cancer was crazy. But I also knew if I did that, I wouldn't have to do radiation and chemo and I would be done. And for me, I was like, okay, if I can be done with cancer in 6 months after I've tormented my family for all these years, I'm out. And then little did I know that in solid tumors, the risk of infection goes way up, and I was still battling 18 months later.
Mm, mm.
So it's just two different, the different cancers, they're all tough and they all have different stories. But the one thing they all have in common is find them early because you're
Mm.
going to have a lot more options and it's going to be a lot easier on everybody.
Yeah.
Even when you look at the caregiver studies, the patients that are diagnosed early stage are doing great, and so is their caregiver. It's when you get to later stages that now the patient is really sick, the caregiver has to step in to help with decisions and taking care of the patient. They're missing work, they're missing their livelihood, and stress just bubbles.
Yeah, yeah, plus you do a lot of kind of individual counseling work. Because I know that every time anybody I know gets myeloma, I send them your way and I just give them your cell phone number. But
I'm always, it's funny,
usually.
I'm always happy to help because I know how I felt when I got the diagnosis and I didn't know where to turn. And I think that was another reason I wrote the book was I finished these calls with patients. I typically follow the same routine of asking them specific questions and kind of going through where they were. And I felt like that was why I needed to do the book, because at the end of the call, they would always look at me and go, oh my God, like in 20 minutes with you, you just saved me 5 months of pure aggravation. I understand it so much better. And I finally have some hope. And I thought to myself, this is not a sustainable model of me doing this, one-on-one. It's just not going to work. And I'm not going to help everybody if I do it this way. And then I thought, if I can put it all in writing, that would be a gift for the patients and the doctors who serve them and the caregivers. And it would make life a heck of a lot better for everybody. And then, as you know, you don't have to buy the book. I put the 12 steps on my website so anybody can have them. And I'll keep building that site out so people can just go to my site if they need it.
Oh, they should buy your book. Come on.
Yeah. Well, the book is a nice companion, so you don't feel so alone. You'll read it and feel like, oh God, that like, I get that. I understand how she was feeling. It's kind of like you read my story, but you find your own cure. I'm just jogging your little memory to think, did I do that? Should I do that? Like, I'm just like that voice in the back of your head.
No, it's fantastic. And this is a really difficult question. Is there anything I forgot to ask?
You covered a lot, actually.
Hope so.
You really did. No, I think you covered it all. I really do.
Well,
I do.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes,
The only
Dr.
other piece, and this was something that I saw on the cancer letter that was amazing, and I'm doing a piece on this, and I don't think it's for what you and I are doing, but just so you know. So, two people I interviewed in the book were Arif
Oh, yeah.
at ACS and Karen Newson at ACS, right? Which
Yeah.
I don't normally do two people from one organization, but I started with Karen and then she loves him. And basically he runs the whole navigation program for ACS. And then I saw your whole piece on Medicare reimbursement and the two of them were interviewed. So you spurred me on to write back to them and say, guys, I don't fully understand this. What's going on with it? And so Arif started explaining it to me and explaining that ACS is doing some of the training. And they told me that one of their biggest problems is people don't know that the reimbursement's happening. And the community hospitals where they could be getting navigators on board and things like that don't know to do it. And the patients don't know to ask for it. So I did say to him, like, my whole point of doing the book is I am your navigator. You know, I'm just there to help navigate you through the system. And that's why I spoke to Arif and said, you know, if there's anything I can do to help you with this and let people know that it's really important. Like, I do agree. One of the short-term solutions to the mess of our broken medical system is getting more navigation in. Because I don't know how else you solve these really big problems unless you can bring in navigators that look like the patient. Like I always say to MMR, if we have, just so you know, Polly, we have full-time nurse navigators that come out of the major cancer centers. These are really, really smart ladies. And they will work with the patient from beginning, from the moment of diagnosis till the end. And they know every center, every doctor, every study. And yet the call center, in my mind, is underutilized.
Mhm.
And it's because you'd be shocked. And this is one other thing I would add to the article. You would be shocked to know it takes a long time for a patient to find a patient foundation, a long time. And often it's like 1/3 of the patients ever find them. And even then they're scared to give their email because of privacy issues. And yet these foundations, you know, and I say this, longevity, PanCan, MMRF, ACS, these are really well-run organizations with a wealth of information for a patient. So when they get stuck, there are places for them to go, not for every cancer, but for a lot of them. And they've just got to pick up the phone and call, you
Mhm.
know, just call. They'd be surprised at all the things that these groups offer.
Mhm.
And I'm
Mhm.
always surprised the doctors are so busy, they don't tell the patient that there is an organization out there. It would be such a gift. And I said that to Arif. I said, it's great if the community hospitals and everybody can put together navigation programs and bring in trained navigators at the hospitals. But I pray that they do a much better job of explaining to the patient that there are disease-specific foundations out there that are really well run. And if you're questioning it, go to Charity Navigator. You can see if they have a good rating and if they've done well. It's not hard.
Well, some of it is also politics. I think some of the groups should be politicized.
Yes.
One of my favorites on that score is the National Breast Cancer Coalition, because that's a model of a group that became very political,
Yeah.
in a good way.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And
And it's so like, this is where you, again, you have to decide as an organization, you can't do everything. And that's why writing the strategic plan and being such a business-minded group is so important. You can't do everything because you don't always have the money to do everything. And so it can vary. You can be a great organization focused on policy and really changing the world. I think Ellen Siegel does this really well too. Like there's different people that take on these jobs, but you know, Ellen would be the first to tell you she's not going to sit there and do what I did, you know, literally living and breathing the research and drug development side. But that was my love, and myeloma needed new drugs. So it was quite an effective way to go. But the organizations are all different, but there are so many resources if patients know about them. And again, depending on what matters to you, whether it's a policy issue or finding a drug